Good morning. My name is Matt Howard. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Virtru. I want to welcome you today to our conversation with Bill Dougherty, the CISO at Omada Health. Today's session is entitled From Good to Great: How Omada Health is Transforming Virtual Healthcare with Zero Trust Data Control. I want to emphasize before we get started the word conversation, because we've had the great pleasure of talking to Bill over the years and getting to know him and his business. And a session like today is exactly that. It's just a conversation. It's an opportunity to kind of have authentic and honest dialogue with a true industry expert, somebody who's kind of working on the front lines every day and handling the hard issues of modern cybersecurity and zero trust security transformations, and how they can be brought to bear to help transform the business of digital health at Omada. To that end, we are incredibly fortunate to be joined by Bill Dougherty, the CISO at Omada Health. Bill, thanks very, very much for being here.
Oh, Matt, it's my pleasure. Great to see you again.
Absolutely. Before we get started and kick things off, I just wanted to share a few quick comments about logistics. We're going to go for about 45 minutes today, depending upon sort of the Q&A variable. If anybody is interested in the audience in asking a question, simply type it into the chat window on your screen, and then we'll have the opportunity to curate those questions on our end, and we'll do our best to get to those questions as they're asked. And then finally, as a reminder, the session today is being recorded. So Bill, as we get this thing kicked off, I want to kind of start with a few questions around zero trust security transformation. Give you kind of a minute to introduce yourself first, and just tell us a little bit about Omada and the work that you guys are doing every single day.
Sure. So I'm the CISO for Omada Health. I've been here a little over 6 years. Omada is an 11-year-old digital health company. We specialize in the prevention and treatment of chronic diseases, primarily type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and musculoskeletal issues. And we do that via a couple of smartphone apps with a digital coach or a live person as the back end, and connected devices. So cellular connected glucometers and blood pressure cuffs and digital scales that give us telemetry on how a person's health is progressing over time. And then behind all of that is a strong machine learning component that helps us figure out when the right time is to intervene in somebody's healthcare journey. So with that, we have hundreds of thousands of patients. Next year, we will cross over 1 million patients. Lots of health data we're trying to protect. My role at Omada is twofold. I run our internal IT systems, and more importantly, I run security for the entire company.
That's fantastic. That sounds, first of all, like an incredibly noble cause, and at the same time, it does sound like you guys are generating a ton of sensitive data that needs to be ultimately governed. I guess one thing I'd love to get your thoughts on is this concept of, perimeterless security, or the conversation around how IT perimeters are evaporating as everybody is moving to the cloud. Is this really a thing? Is this overstated, understated? And what does it mean for you at Omada?
It's definitely a thing, and I think it depends on the company. So I've got a few gray hairs. I've been doing this a long time. I remember managing frame relay networks to connect 5250 terminals to an AS400. That is not what Omada's world is. Omada was born in the cloud and lives in the cloud. So our core product all runs in AWS, but all the corporate IT that I'm responsible for is SaaS first, SaaS only, cloud first, cloud only infrastructure. So the perimeter has changed. And then it changed further in the last couple of years under COVID. So pre-COVID, we had a large contingent of remote workers, but somewhere between 60–70% of the company was in the office every day. And so we had a traditional office, and we thought of it in more of a traditional network that we just then had SaaS products. COVID hit, we sent everybody home, and then we pivoted the whole company to now being a remote first company. So I closed down 3/4 of my real estate. I'm standing in my last remaining office, but this office behaves more like a co-working space, and we designed it in the last year and a half to operate as a co-working space, which means from a security perspective, this is an untrusted office. The network here is no different than the network at an employee's house or at a Starbucks or anything else. From a security perspective, we don't trust this network. So my perimeter is now out in the cloud.
So you didn't say the word zero trust in those comments, but clearly there's a lot of conversation in the industry these days. Some would argue sort of noise around this sort of term zero trust security. Again, I'm curious, is it noise to you? Does it mean something in particular? Is it relevant? How do you think about that concept, and how does it relate to what you just shared?
I dislike the term. I dislike the term because it isn't actually descriptive of what we do. It's not that we don't trust people or trust other entities. It's the way you approach your compute and your perimeters and things like that, where in the old traditional IT world, we assume that if you're on the internal network, you must be okay. And that was never a good strategy. You had a hardened exterior and a wide open interior, and you're relying on things like your physical security controls to prevent somebody from plugging into your network. Well, now I don't have a network. And so what you replace that with is a set of controls on your users and your devices to make sure that you don't inherently trust them. You're authenticating them every time. So it's not zero trust, but it is kind of a more controlled or a better controlled area where we've pushed the boundary down. So the boundary was my firewall. Well, now the laptop is my firewall.
Right, and your policy controls ultimately gets sort of smaller and smaller, and you move things closer and closer to arguably the data, which is something I wanted to kind of touch on here for a moment. So when you think about kind of that zero trust security architecture that you just kind of outlined, we all, I think, recognize that there's identities and there's people who need to authenticate, and multi-factor is a best practice. We recognize that there's devices that need to be free of malware. We know that there's networks that are ultimately critical in terms of how we access information, and these applications that need to be governed and secured. But if you believe John Kindervag, who was sort of the analyst back in the day, who originally coined the term zero trust, you might sort of argue that zero trust is really first and foremost about the data and protecting the data. Do you subscribe to that school of thought? Just curious to get your thoughts.
Generally speaking, yes. I think the data is the thing you're trying to protect. When you start talking about attack surfaces and protection surfaces and security policies, the first thing is to always understand what's the valuable thing that you're protecting. My laptop has no inherent value to it. It's a $2,000 device. Who cares? A health record has a ton of inherent value, and so we talk about this a lot. We have multiple classifications of data. So for us, we have health information, but even that, we have our patients or our members' health information when they're dealing directly with us. We also have health information from our customers. Our customers are the people who hold risk on a population, which is usually large employers, health plans, health systems. So I have to deal with customer data, which is usually protected health information. I have to deal with member data, which is its own class of protected health information. And then I have my corporate data. And for there, I've got sensitive and confidential information, financials, things like that. And I've got stuff I really don't care about. We use a product to do retros and it's basically digital sticky notes. Really low risk kind of stuff. And so you have to classify and inventory your data, and that is the asset you're trying to protect, and then apply policies to that. And so I do not put the same policies on digital sticky notes as I do on protected health information.
Yeah, and I mean, clearly, I think there's room for conversation when it comes to how do we as an industry, how do we as professionals do the right thing in terms of bringing governance and policy and security controls closer to the data, closer to the objects that we're trying to protect. And at the same time, I don't think any of us are naive. It's absolutely critical that we do the right thing as well, in regards to sort of, the new way of thinking about sort of perimeters or perimeter-less security with identities and devices and networks and applications. And so it's a complicated puzzle, to say the least, and data is arguably just one part of the puzzle, one piece of the puzzle. But I think it's increasingly clear that it's perhaps a critical part. Fair?
Yeah, fair. It's interesting. Data is the thing you're trying to protect. So it's this shiny prize. You don't actually secure data, you secure access to data, you secure movement of data, you secure storage of data, things like that. The data itself is the shiny object. And so you define your policy.
It's the thing that's ultimately, the target of arguably bad actors.
Oh, absolutely. But, if I'm let's go physical here. If I'm a bank vault and I'm trying to protect bars of gold, I put layers of security around that. But if you get through all those layers, the bar of gold is still sitting there. And so you define your data, you define the assets you want to protect and the policies you want to apply to each of those, but you apply those policies to all the things surrounding the data. And that can be your access, that can be your identity, that can be whether or not you trust devices, network policy, legal policy, insurance policy. All of that applies to these things you're trying to protect.
So let's pull that thread just a bit and think about, enterprise organization, putting good governance and good zero trust controls into place to protect access to sensitive information that we possess internal to the business. And then let's juxtapose that with, the same organization potentially looking at applying zero trust policy controls and access controls to sensitive data that we no longer possess because by default we have to share it external to the enterprise. Are they two sides of the same coin, or how do you sort of reconcile those two things?
There's two sides of the same coin. So again, in my world, all of my data resides on somebody else's computers. Like I'm a SaaS first, SaaS only customer. I use Google for email and for Drive. So all of my corporate documents are actually on Google servers. And I use, different solutions for my Salesforce and different solutions for my customer support. So different types of data are out there. And there's some policies I can apply to that data. And sometimes I can just deal with it contractually. And so it's not really a zero trust world because I have to trust those providers. But what I can do is I can assess their security controls, make sure they meet my standards. I can put contractual teeth into the relationship in terms of liability, indemnity, things like that. We can audit them, but we have to understand that we're all in this boat together. And then the other thing I can apply is zero trust concepts to the access to that tool. So we use single sign-on, we apply multi-factor to it. We also use device certificates and geofence them and do other things. So in order to log into one of my sensitive SaaS applications, you must be on a device we provisioned that we trust from because it's got our certificate on it. You must authenticate using credentials we provided. With multi-factor, you must be on an IP range that we trust, things like that. So that's what I can control on my side. And then the vendor's got all of their layers of control on their side. And then there's some instances where we can apply additional policies onto their systems.
Interesting. And then as it relates to a sensitive piece of information that you're sharing externally where you might want to retain sort of a policy control and perhaps revoke access to a particular information, how would you address that?
Well, I think that's why we work with a company like Virtru. So when we started working with Virtru, it was because we wanted the ability to share certain types of information, including occasionally health information, over email. We tried to never do that, but there's certain use cases where that is literally the most effective way to do that. And to do it legally, you have to encrypt it. but there's ways to encrypt email and there's ways to not encrypt email. It's an addressable standard under HIPAA. TLS technically encrypts it in transit, but for us, we didn't want it sitting unencrypted on Google servers, so we wanted to be able to encrypt it client side, and we wanted to be able to apply a policy to it. So we want to be able to revoke it, prevent downloads, watermark it, things like that. That is one example of where I've been able to take a security tool and apply a policy to a SaaS provider. So, and in that situation, I don't have to trust Google because Google only sees the encrypted payload. I also don't have to trust Virtru. Virtru never sees the payload. Virtru just manages the keys. So we've separated the lock from the keys. And depending on the message we're sending, I don't even necessarily have to trust the recipient because I can put all kinds of restrictions on it.
Right. Yeah. And this is bringing up an important topic. I know you and I have sort of chatted about this in the past, and it's just, you mentioned the word trust. I'd love to sort of remove ourselves, if you will, from the mundane elements of IT and just think about trust as it relates to you, your business, kind of how you see the world as a healthcare provider. What does trust look like from your vantage these days?
It is foundational to everything we do. So the core of all of our healthcare is trust, because we are doing behavior change. If you want to provide treatment for somebody who has type 2 diabetes, what you're really doing is trying to get them to change their behavior around food, exercise, taking their medication, things like that. And if you do that, you can make them healthier. And in order to get access to those patients, our customers have to trust that we have good security controls, because they're turning over their population, which can be in the millions of people. They need to trust that. And then the patients that come to us, they have to also trust us. They have to trust that we're being good stewards of their data. They have to trust that the advice we're giving them is beneficial, that is clinically dictated. So trust is the foundation of our entire business model. And I always say that my department's mission within the greater company is to earn and prove that trust every day, so that we will continue to get customers and continue to get patients. So, you know, we do an awful lot, not only to secure our data, but to provide proof to our customers and our partners that we are good stewards of the data.
Yeah, and I think we all in the last, I don't know, 5-7 years of this industry have become, I think sensitized and familiar with this concept of digital supply chains and third-party risk. You were talking earlier about how you can control what you can control, but there's third parties increasingly, especially in a cloud-first, kind of born in the cloud type business like Omada, and you're constantly assessing, risk and trust with respect to third parties that aren't Omada. So with that kind of concept and bringing trust back a little bit closer to kind of the IT domain, how do you think about that trust as it relates to like cloud service providers? Like, for example, would someone like you look at like a Google and a Microsoft and an Amazon through the same lens, through a different lens? How do you reconcile trust in the hyperscaler sense of public cloud providers?
It's an interesting question, and I'm going to go back to where you started, which was third-party trust. I have a team of people under me that their whole job is third-party trust, but for me, it's actually fourth-party, fifth-party, sixth-party trust, because my customers are trusting me with their data. I am then trusting a variety of service providers with that data as well. So let's say, I run my core business on Amazon, but I also use a SaaS provider, and that SaaS provider is splitting their business between Amazon and GCP, and also they're using SaaS providers or other vendors. So now we start getting into this fourth party, fifth party, sixth party trust mechanism.
Transitive dependencies.
Exactly. So you have to be really careful. Now, you asked, how do I think about Google versus Microsoft versus Amazon? And to me, it's a little bit like asking, how do I think about a hammer versus a drill? They're both tools, and I can hang a picture on the wall. I'm an old Microsoft guy. I was an MCSE back in the NT4 and Windows 2000 days. So I don't have any inherent distrust of Microsoft, but I don't use them right now other than for general office suite occasionally. We use Google because A, that's what I inherited, but B, for a business of our size, it is nimble, it's easy, everyone understands it, and their security is good. We use AWS for cloud, and we haven't switched to GCP, partly because AWS does a good job, and I can find engineers that know it, partly because the switching costs are too high. So I think all of the big providers are, generally speaking, good and doing the best they can and are good partners. I think that when you go beyond the big providers, you now have to really dig in more carefully into what are their security practices. Are they investing in security? Is it something that is considered strategic to the company? And are they doing what they say they will do?
Yeah, and that whole concept of fourth, fifth, sixth level transitive dependencies is near and dear to my heart. As I think you know, I spent a lot of time in the software supply chain, ecosystem, sort of contemplating, this idea of third-party software, open source libraries being consumed and put into production software, and how frequently do we as development and engineering teams sort of think about the hygiene relative to our primary dependencies, let alone our third-party dependencies, because to your point, everything is a nested doll. There's just so much sort of interdependency built into the modern digital ecosystem that it's really important to A, understand that, and then B, sort of find ways to sort of see the bigger picture. But trust is paramount for sure. And I kind of, this is a self-serving question. I apologize in advance, but I would like to know, and for the audience, sort of get your perspective on how you think about Virtru in the context of that same trust dynamic. You mentioned earlier one of the things that Virtru does for you is separating lock and key. So how does Virtru as a vendor play into that view of trust?
Well, severalfold. First of all, in order to use Virtru, I have to trust you. Okay. So when we were evaluating email encryption solutions, we had one that was a gateway product, and I didn't like it, not because they weren't inherently trustworthy, but fundamentally I didn't like the design because they only encrypted email leaving my organization. It still sat unencrypted in Google. So I needed something that would give me client-side encryption. From there, and then it's a question of how exactly does the data flow? And what I liked about Virtru was the data never flows to you. It's all client side. You're just providing the ability to encrypt it, and the ability to decrypt it, equally important. And you're doing it based on the trusted document format, which is pretty good. You then become another hammer or drill in my toolkit to say, hey, can I apply Virtru in a specific use case to a specific vendor or a specific partner to add a layer of security when I don't trust them? The example of that for me, well, right now, we historically have never allowed anything with PHI on Google Drive. Why? Because Google Drive is inherently a platform built on a sharing security model, and we have an obligation to protect the data, and not just protect it, but limit access to those who really need it. So we've had this hardened rule which says thou shalt not put PHI on Google Drive, which is great, except for my clinical staff. They actually need a place where they can occasionally collaborate on a patient or a product or things like that. And Google's the best collaboration tool we have. So they've come to me and say, hey, how can we do that? Well, you've got a new product, or relatively new, at least for me, on adding drive encryption via your plugin. And it's not perfect, but it's pretty darn good. And so we looked at it and we said, yeah, let's give that a try. And we're still kind of in the stages of rolling that out because we want everybody to understand what it means, because collaborating on an encrypted document is a little bit different than collaborating on an unencrypted document. But the foundation of it is still the same, which is I can use a best-in-class collaboration tool but I don't have to trust the provider of it with this most sensitive type of information. And I don't have to trust Virtru either. With the data, all I have to trust is that you are encrypting it and decrypting it appropriately. But a whole different class of data we don't care about. So that can go on drive unencrypted.
Yeah. You use the word encryption a fair amount in that sort of conversation about trust, which makes a ton of sense. I'm not sure if you're aware or not, but last Friday was World Encryption Day, which was sort of an interesting community event as we collectively, again, everyone's in this boat together, as you said earlier. And I think encryption is one of these things that continues to sort of surface as um, you know a best practice until it isn't. The joke I like to use is the hard thing about encryption is decryption. It's such a good idea, but it doesn't often become sort of part and parcel of the way we typically do our normal work. And I'm wondering, why is that? Why is encryption not something that's more fundamental to a broader set of workflows?
God, that's a great question. I struggle with this because, well, first of all, we should recognize the fact that it has gotten massively better in the last 20 years.
Right.
It used to be that it was rare that you would visit a website and you'd get HTTPS and you'd get a certificate and, oh, look, we've got a lock in the browser and life's good. Now you get warned if you visit an unencrypted website. So we've flipped the user behavior, flipped the paradigm. Encryption is just one form of security, and to me, one of those rules is, in order for security to be effective, it has to be easy on the end user. It doesn't necessarily need to be easy on the security team, but if it is difficult, a user will find any way possible to bypass it. So again, and a little self-serving for you, but one of the reasons we chose Virtru for email was because it's super easy. We're already a Gmail customer. Everybody's using Chrome. Put a plug-in into the browser, and now if you want to encrypt the message, click a button. If you want to not encrypt it, click a button, and we can apply some rules to say, oh, that looks like it's got PHI in it. We're just going to go ahead and encrypt it for you automatically. Really, really easy. User adoption was near instantaneous for us, and everyone loved it because we went from something that was difficult to use to something that was easy to use. So why is encryption not more pervasive? Because we haven't made it easy, and
Right.
partly because encryption
Right.
isn't easy.
Right. It's certainly something we spend a lot of time just constantly striving for here is UX and understand the critical nature of that as we kind of imagine encryption becoming more standard across a wide variety of information workflows. I want to pull a thread on something, and this is not intended to be hyperbolic in any way. So I just we're sitting here today. We have the benefit of a conversation with you, and sometimes in our industry, especially in our industry, I think we have an unbelievably dynamic and rapid news flow. And it was just a little more than a week ago that there was, on this very topic of encryption, public reports in Bleeping Computer and a wide variety of other editorial outlets about a new vulnerability that had been sort of disclosed publicly as it related to Microsoft OME and their use of a particular encryption technology called ECB, an encryption cipher, which basically, I think, means that the cipher was weak, and if somebody happened to get a hold of an encrypted email or a sufficient number of encrypted emails, they could basically look at the ciphertext and sort of observe a pattern and then sort of infer, at least partially, if not entirely, what's under the covers in the plain text. Did this come across your radar? I'm curious just to kind of know whether this hit your desk at all and what you think about that.
Yeah, I saw the headlines. I read a little bit about it. I was comforted by the fact that I don't use Office 365 for email, so I didn't need to go too deep on it. I'd like to avoid the pile on here. So one of the things that is true is fundamentally security is a business decision. How much you as a company are going to invest in any security solution is a function of what you're trying to protect and why. And my read of the situation is Microsoft made a decision that every SaaS provider, every business makes every single day. And what I mean by that is it wasn't so much that a vulnerability was or a bug was discovered, it's that they had a legacy product using an older cipher called ECB, I think, and they'd already released a newer thing that they were encouraging customers to go to. I think it's called Purview. I could be wrong about that. But they were keeping ECB for backwards compatibility because, hey, I've got 5 years of email encrypted with this, and if you don't still support ECB, I can't read my email. So that's kind of a problem.
Right.
And it's a problem with all security. But they made a business decision to say, we're not going to fix it. We're just going to encourage people to move on. Now, do I think that they were forthcoming enough with their customers? Probably not. Do I think that they should have been more vocal about, hey, we have this out there. It is a weakness. We really want you to move to this newer thing that we have. And you should probably prioritize it because we now have indication that not only is the cipher weak, but it's exploitable. And I think that the subsequent headlines have come in to say that, yeah, you thought it wasn't exploitable because you'd need a large number of messages. Turns out that if you're a large corporation sending and receiving email every day, capturing a large number of messages may not be all that difficult.
Right.
But fundamentally, they did something that every vendor out there that I deal with does, which is they get reports of vulnerabilities, they do a risk assessment, they look at their threat model, they classify it, and then they determine what they're going to fix and what they're not. And I don't know a single vendor out there that is bug-free, issue-free. Not one.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think it's super well said, and there's this is a hard enough problem. I mean, healthcare is a complicated thing, as we talked about previously, and modern cybersecurity is unbelievably complicated, and so this is not intended to be at all hyperbolic or piling on in any way. I do think it though begs an interesting question about something like crypto agility. If we're all sitting here today and we're all sort of able to intellectually relate to how something like encryption can become more fundamental to the way we exchange information for purposes of improving security and privacy, that's awesome. But I think it's also critical that we recognize that our view of encryption isn't necessarily set in stone, and something that we consider to be good encryption today may not be good encryption tomorrow, and we have to be prepared to sort of, swap it out and be prepared for, who knows, a future that might involve something like quantum, where most, if not all, encryption could be subject to some type of vulnerability. I'm just curious to kind of get your thoughts on that concept of where we are versus where the future might be, and what crypto agility means to you.
Yeah, I think it's a truism that all forms of encryption will eventually be broken, and if we're smart, we will then replace them with the next form of encryption. Crypto agility is easy for data in transit because it's temporal. So we can go from TLS 1.2 to 1.3, and if the browser supports it and the server supports it, and now data in transit is fine. It's much harder for data at rest because you still have to be able to go back and read that data. And if the data at rest is something that is sensitive enough that it needs to be re-encrypted, now you get into really complicated things. So let's just take us. We've got our back-end database systems, and we encrypt the drives at rest. We also encrypt individual columns, and we're continuously trying to encrypt other columns. But what happens when all of that data, the cipher there, is expired, and now we have to essentially unencrypt and re-encrypt it with the latest thing? That's a problem, and it's a problem that is maybe unsolvable. Meaning, if I accept the premise that all cipher technology is going to get broken, then I am accepting the premise that I will have a certain amount of tech debt, which is legacy ciphers, and I will have a certain overhead of every year having to go back and replace it, and part of that means re-securing it. In the physical world, you could say that's not that much different than having a locksmith come in and replace the locks on your doors. It's just you're protecting something more valuable, and it's harder to do.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's sobering, and I think kind of important for people to relate to, just as it, you know, helps paint a picture for, recent events and sort of this looming, I'm not sure how close or far something like quantum is, but it just continues to be an interesting thing that, I read about and lurks in the back of my mind. While we have you, we'll wrap this up here with this kind of last little topic, and this is, I think, speaks to the fact that we're all in this industry together. We're all in this boat together. It's complicated. It's hard. It's not just technology. It's increasingly a bunch of other weird things that I don't think any of us would have imagined we would ever be talking about. But here we are. And in the last, 3 weeks, we've seen news about a former CISO at Uber, Joe Sullivan, being found criminally guilty in a federal court for something that he did while employed at Uber, relative to, paying a bounty on a breach. And I just, I know you're a CISO, and in your profession, I'm just kind of curious what your take is on that. I mean, this is arguably changed the game for lots of people like you sitting in your chair. What are your thoughts?
It's all everybody wants to talk about right now. And I think
Well, I would have been remiss to not bring it up then.
right, I think that, you know, pardon the pun, but I think the verdict is still out on this one. I don't know if Joe is the hero or the villain in this story. I expect a little bit of both, but and I didn't watch the trial, but I've read a lot on it, and my take is that Joe did something that CISOs do all the time. So we've always known that there's this gray area for bug bounties, and it always feels a little shady. The whole industry is interesting. Joe's mandate was to protect data. Flat out, is to protect data. He was the victim, in a sense, or as the representative of Uber, of a cybercrime. And he, along with his legal department, determined that the best way to protect that data was to pay a ransom, get the data back. He had some reasonable confidence that he could get the data back. And he communicated that information to the CEO, the old CEO. And then for most companies, that would not be illegal. But it just happened that they were under an FTC investigation that predated Joe's time. That's one fact. And so the government's case is basically, I think, that he didn't report it to the FTC and he had an obligation to do so. I'm not sure he did, because the obligation to report was the company's obligation, not Joe as an individual. I
Yeah.
I also think that he made some mistakes, like he told the old CEO and not the new CEO. I think my guess is he didn't tell the board of directors. And so I think there's some lessons to be learned. One is you really have to evaluate whether or not you want to do a bug bounty program. We don't do one. Although when I was in Vegas at Black Hat this year, I was evaluating bug bounty providers. And the takeaway I came back with was the whole program is a little shady. It makes these perverse incentives that I don't necessarily want to make. And it doesn't feel for us like it's the right way to go. I'm happy to pay professional organizations that I have a contractual relationship with to come attack my systems all the time. I don't want to incentivize random researchers, if I can call them researchers, to come attack. And the incentives for the research community are kind of interesting. Like I sat in on a couple talks about this, and I'm not trying to denigrate researchers. There are some great researchers out there. They're doing fantastic work, but their incentive is go find an unreported vulnerability in some mainstream product. And if you find it, you then go pull two lists. You pull a list of every company you can find that is using that product, and you cross that with every company that has a published bug bounty program, and that now becomes your target list, and you contact all of them at once and say, hey, you have a vulnerability, pay me. Okay? And that's what
Yeah.
a legitimate researcher does. An illegitimate researcher, which is I think what hit Uber, goes and steals your data and then charges you ransom. And that's the difference between a $5,000 bug bounty and a $100,000 bug bounty.
Right.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
I think there's mistakes that were made. I think for CISOs, there are definitely lessons to be learned. One of which is to make sure your incident response policy says that you are not responsible for determining notification. That's easy for me. In healthcare, we always have had this notification obligation to the federal government, to the Office of Civil Rights, for any breach of healthcare. So as a result, I have a privacy officer who's an attorney, and I have a risk committee and the CEO, and then I have the audit committee with the board of directors. Somebody else other than me gets to make the determination of is notification necessary. But make that somebody else's responsibility for the CISO, and make sure you don't hide things. Like it's inconceivable to me that you could make $100,000 payment, even in a company the size of Uber, to anybody, and that didn't involve somebody in finance and your financial controls, that didn't involve your legal department, the GC, the CEO, like that there's something's just inconceivable there, and I suspect there's more behind the scenes than we really know.
Yeah, and that's what's crazy about this industry and this conversation is that's all sort of like 3 weeks fresh, and then yet I wasn't even aware until this morning that something else, sort of another shoe drops on this same topic involving a company called Drizzly. You care to sort of comment, just for the benefit of the audience, what happened in the last 12 hours?
Yeah, so Drizzly, which got bought out coincidentally by Uber, they're also under an FTC investigation, I think, for a previous breach. And the FTC released a preliminary ruling, and part of the ruling for Drizzly is the FTC is trying to make the CEO of Drizzly personally responsible for it. So they're conveying personal reliability onto him. And they are, in their ruling, they're trying to make that responsibility follow him if he leaves Drizzly and goes to any other company, that they want him responsible for implementing a security program there with FTC oversight. So they're basically painting a scarlet letter on him and trying to make him unemployable. That's my opinion. And in the process, they're trying to scare the crap out of CEOs and CISOs. That dovetails nicely to some of the rules being considered by the SEC right now, where they're trying to force boards to put more security people on the board of directors. To me, this is just a replay of what happened under Sarbanes-Oxley, where we made CEOs and CFOs personally liable for the financials. Now we're going to make CEOs and CISOs personally liable for the security. And that's kind of a dangerous precedent. It certainly doesn't make me feel terribly comfortable, because let's say that numbers are a little more precise than security. Security is risk management. You're making educated bets, and you will eventually have a breach. Everybody does. You're making a business decision, you're playing the odds, and you're trying to apply the right controls at the right time to balance usability, security, running the business. It's a really tough job, and making somebody personally liable financially or criminally for a wrong but well-intentioned decision is not great.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Unbelievably interesting world we're living in. And we are incredibly fortunate to be able to just kind of talk about these topics with an expert such as yourself, who's kind of living on that sharp tip of the spear, so to speak, day in and day out, just moving the ball forward and, fighting the good fight. It is, we are about at time. I'm going to encourage, if there's anyone that has any questions they would like to ask, please do so now. I'll be able to kind of get a quick look at them, and we can get them in front of Bill. I'll give it a few minutes just to see if there's any questions. But otherwise, Bill, thank you again. Super interesting insight into what it's really like to be sort of leading an innovative healthcare provider like Omada, doing, the great sort of clinical work that you guys do to help people sort of, address healthcare, which in my view is probably one of the most, if not the most important thing anyone can be doing, but to do it securely with the amount of information, the amount of governance, the amount of regulations that you have to contend with every single day in sort of this new digital world, is kudos to you, kudos to the team at Omada for all of the great work that you guys are doing, and thank you again very, very much for being here today. We are grateful.
Thanks, Matt. I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the conversation, and I hope we will continue having these conversations. And also, if there are people on the session that want to continue this conversation offline, you can find me on LinkedIn. Please reach out. Happy to keep chatting.
Fantastic. Thanks, Bill. Have a wonderful day.
You too.